Good morning. My name is Neel Kashkari. I'm president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. Welcome to our fall 2017 conference of the Opportunity and Inclusive Growth Institute. I want to just step back for a moment and remind everyone about why this institute was formed. In February of this year, we announced this institute, and their purpose is really to take advantage of the extraordinary research capabilities across the Federal Reserve System and to focus them on issues of economic opportunity and inclusive growth. We know a lot of work is being done around the country and around the world, but we at the Fed feel like we have a role to play too. And if we can bring our own research capabilities, our unique capabilities to bear, then that's an important contribution we want to make. So we want to take advantage of the strength of the Federal Reserve System. We want to embrace a multidisciplinary approach to address some of these really important challenges. Hopefully come up with policy solutions that we can recommend either for implementation by the Federal Reserve or for other policymakers to consider. And importantly, it's not just about the Minneapolis Fed. It really is a collaboration across the Federal Reserve System. We launched, as I said, about 10 months ago. One of my very pleasant surprises is when we started reaching out to form our advisory board, the quality of people we were able to attract is really world-class, and it speaks to how important these issues are, and it speaks to people's optimism about what role the Federal Reserve can potentially play. So I'm really appreciative of all of our advisors, many of whom are here today for a second or third time. So thank you for being here. We're in the process of launching a community advisory board, starting with local policymakers, local nonprofit leaders. And the point of this is to ground what we're doing. A lot of the work we're going to do here is academic. It's very, in some cases, theoretical. It's very scientific. We want to ground that repeatedly, continuously with real-world experience of what practitioners are seeing every day, and that advisory board is going to be a very important part of that effort. We announced a visiting scholar program. We thought we'd start small, maybe 3 to 5 visiting scholars in our first year. Much to our surprise, we had great demand among very highly qualified scholars, and we ended up with 17 visiting scholars for this cycle, some of whom are here for a short period of time, some of whom are here for a year. But again, the fact that we had such overwhelming demand out of the gate speaks to how important these issues are and people's optimism for what role the Federal Reserve can play. So to our scholars who are here, thank you for being here. Thank you for stepping forward. And we're going to be in the market again, recruiting the next batch of visiting scholars very soon. So please get the word out there. This is our second conference. Our first one was in May, a very wide-ranging conference looking at a wide range of issues. Out of that came a focus on segregation for our next conference. And I don't know what our spring conference is going to be yet. We need to do the work, see where the research leads us, and we're going to dig deeper and deeper. So, we're learning as we go, so to speak. And then lastly, I want to just point out a working paper series that we've announced and put out on our web, which is not just showcasing research from the Minneapolis Fed and from our visiting scholars who are here, but from across the Federal Reserve System. Already in the first less than a year, we have over 20 papers on our working paper series, again, showcasing the work that's being done around the Federal Reserve System. And I think that that's great. One last thing I want to just point out is we do work closely with all the other reserve banks. And so the Cleveland Fed has sent us something which is very interesting and important. And it's a display that's right out front of this room, which is a display on the Freedmen's Bank. It's a bank that was created to try to serve newly emancipated slaves in American history. And that display out there talks about the history of the Freedmen's Bank, the struggles it had, and the people that it served. But I do appreciate the Cleveland Fed sharing that with us, as it was, I think, appropriate for all of us to recognize. So thank you again for joining us today. This is just the start. The Federal Reserve System is committed to this kind of work. The Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis is absolutely committed to this kind of work. And it's all about you, right? I always say, you didn't come here to listen to me. I came here to listen to you. So thank you for being here. And I'd like to turn it over to Aaron, who's going to host our first panel. Thank you.
Thank you. So first, I want to thank the Institute for putting this conference together and inviting these great panelists, putting the program together. Also, just commend the wisdom and the courage of the Fed leadership and staff in tackling this issue. I mean, this is really the idea of inclusive growth and opportunity is the key issue of our time in our state, in our region, in our country, and in our world. How do we harness the benefits of growth and make sure that they're shared broadly and we have an inclusive vision for our economy and our society is exactly the key questions that we are wrestling with. And I'll tell you that it was, I think, very wise and very courageous to put down that marker in February. That was not the prevailing mood, and that took courage to do that. I was working at the White House Council of Economic Advisors then, and I was so excited when that was announced, and it's pushing for important priorities, and I appreciate the leadership that was shown. So we're going to kick off the panel, and I will introduce each speaker and ask them to lead off. We start with Assistant Professor Kendra Bischoff from Cornell, Sociology. She got her PhD from Stanford in 2011. She won the American Education Research Association Outstanding Dissertation Award. She's won a fellowship from the National Academy of Education. Her work documents patterns in income segregation over time in the US and the relationship between rising income inequality and increasing income segregation. And that's what she's going to tell us about today. So please take it away.
Okay.
Each speaker will have about 30 minutes, and then we'll have about 30 minutes of Q&A at the end.
Okay. Do I need to do something to? Oh, they'll do it for me. Okay, great. Okay. Thank you so much for having me here today. I'm really honored to be a part of this conference and on this panel. I'm going to talk about big picture and try to set up the problem for us today. I've took a look at Stephen and Larry's slides, and I think altogether we're going to provide a really rich description of the state of the problem, as well as thinking about theories of how unequal place-based opportunities might affect children as well as adults, and then also we're going to get some outcomes, I think, from Larry. Okay, so I'm going to move forward here. Is this? Okay. Which one? This one? Got it. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, here's a roadmap for what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to try to lay out the problem by talking about the definition and motivation for studying place-based inequality or residential income sorting. I'll talk a little bit about measurement. It was in the title of the panel, so I'm going to say a little bit about that. Then I'll present some trends, and then move to talking about particularly contexts for children. A lot of the work we've done has been motivated by unequal contexts for children in this really important developmental stage during the school years, and of course prior to the school years as well. So then I'm going to move on and talk a little bit about income segregation between school districts in particular, and some new work that I've been doing on looking at inequality in access to financial and social resources in those school districts of children from different economic backgrounds. And then I'll offer a few concluding thoughts. Okay, so what is residential income sorting? I'm going to call it income sorting because I'm going to talk about two slightly different ways of measuring income sorting, and one's a little bit more specifically segregation oriented. But most basically, it's the uneven distribution of households or families or individuals or any kind of small unit across neighborhoods, school districts, could be political jurisdictions by income. Okay, so I in particular mention different units that we might study this between because it actually matters for the results that you get. Households in the census could be single individuals or families or two people living without kids. Families are people who are related by blood or marriage. And then, of course, individuals can be people living by themselves. And actually, income segregation differs between these different kinds of groups. We often measure it between neighborhoods or census tracts, but of course, we can pick any unit. So I'm going to also talk about income segregation between school districts today, which is a meaningful organizational unit that actually confers real advantages and disadvantages through resources and tax dollars. Okay, so sort of intuitively, this is a map that gives you a sense of what we're talking about here. Most of you will probably recognize this as Chicago, the Chicago metropolitan area. And what we've done here very simply is just to create a ratio of the median family income within each census tract in relation to the median family income in the metropolitan area as a whole. Okay, and then we've color-coded each census tract into a category that we've called affluent, middle income, or poor. So the purple coloring our poorer neighborhoods, and the green coloring our more affluent neighborhoods. And so a familiar pattern emerges. If everyone probably familiar with Chicago, where the south side and the west side of the city are largely purple, and we have a strip of affluence that kind of goes up along the lake there. Okay, so this isn't a summary measure of segregation in Chicago, but it gives us a sense of what we're drawing from when we're thinking about sorting across these units. Another thing I want to note here is that there are different sort of macro versus micro clustering of neighborhoods that might lead to differential predictions about how these patterns affect outcomes. So for instance, when you see sort of checkerboard patterns, you might think of neighborhoods that are quickly switching between poorer and richer median family incomes versus these sort of vast swaths of green or purple, in which you think you'd have to travel very far to get to a neighborhood that looks different than the one you live in. And we might think differently about how those neighborhoods affect people's outcomes. If you have to travel 3, 4, 5 miles to reach some kind of amenity, it's probably more unlikely that you would do so than if it was in the neighborhood right next door. Okay, so this is just sort of a dimension of clustering that we might think about as we ask questions about the effects of income segregation or income sorting. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about theory of place, and I think we'll hear a little bit more about that from Stephen in particular. So why does place matter? I'm a sociologist, and so we tend to think about these issues a lot, contextual effects, social structural effects on individuals, but also on the nature of places in themselves, right? Collective efficacy, these kinds of notions. And so intuitively, I think everyone would say, well, there's a lot of sort of negative things about living in areas with low resources, right? So that's a very general statement that we might think that there's negative consequences to living in low resource neighborhoods. But I think if we think a little more carefully about it, it can help us come to more specific hypotheses about the mechanisms through which these neighborhoods are affecting people. It might lead us to think about who might be more or less affected by living in these kinds of neighborhoods, children versus adults, for instance, girls versus boys, for instance. Okay, and it might also help us think a little bit about the kinds of outcomes that we expect to see differences in, or the kinds of outcomes that we might not expect to see differences. So I'm going to talk a little bit about theory in hopes that it kind of helps us think about what is it about these neighborhoods that might matter. Okay, so one factor, one bucket is socialization. Okay, people learn from the people they see around them. They learn from the institutions that they're embedded in, such as schools and neighborhoods and churches. Okay, and we think as sociologists, and I think as everybody, right, that socialization really teaches us what to expect from the world, what to hope for, and what kind of norms dominate in the atmospheres that we're going to sort of operate in. Another bucket is access to opportunities. Okay, this is a little more obvious in some ways, but obviously there are public resource differences across neighborhoods, schools being a major one that we think of, but we might also think about green space, we might also think about libraries, we might also think about all the kinds of things, right, that come with the neighborhoods that you live in. Okay, I didn't list it here, but jobs, right, access to jobs is another big one. What is the local labor market? And for some people, that labor market might be much more narrowly local, depending on access to transportation and these kinds of issues, childcare. Okay, and then of course people. People are a big part of our opportunity structure, right? Who's around us, right? And segueing into our next bucket it's our setting for our social networks. Okay, there's a lot of research showing that social networks matter a lot for health in the long term, social support, it's what we might call social capital. That term is used very loosely across lots of different fields, but at a very basic level, it's the value that we derive from social connections, which could be a whole host of things. But we often think about information, right? Who do we get information from? And for children, that could be information about college, the application process, for instance, right? But for adults, it could be information about jobs or any number of other things that might help us increase our well-being, okay? Social networks can also help provide social support in times of need, as well as material support. Okay, so all of these things might be affected by your social context. And finally, exposure to harm. Okay, there's other people who are working on the effects of exposure to harm and differential harm across place. So we might think of environmental harm, pollution, these kinds of things, as well as people-based harm, violence. So there's good work that looks at the effect of incidents of violence on student test scores, And there's a lot more work to be done, but thinking about the physical, social, psychological, and emotional toll that these environmental harms can have on people and how it might affect their socialization, what to expect from their neighborhoods. Okay, so I think about these. This is certainly not a full list of mechanisms, but it's sort of a way to start thinking about what kinds of things about neighborhoods, what might we want to test in thinking about how do we think these places affect people. So then what are the consequences of segregation or place-based inequality? So I've just said there's all these resources or harms that are in neighborhoods. And so obviously when we get segregation by income, which is what I'm talking about in particular today, but if, it overlays with racial segregation as well, that you get unequal distribution of these resources and harm, which then of course can lead to gaps, right? So income-based gaps in the kind of positive outcomes that we might care about. So it might be achievement, it might be health, it might be any number of things such as employment, okay? But we might also get things like concentration of political power, right? We know from a lot of research, really in political science recently, that there's a strong correlation between affluence and political influence, as well as political participation. And so when you get income-based sorting in neighborhoods, you might also worry that certain places have undue influence in terms of the political process. It could be through formal elections, but it could be through informal civic processes as well, right? Grassroots movements to, for instance, keep environmental harms out of one's neighborhood, okay? And then finally, inherently, it would lead to a lower probability of diverse interpersonal interactions. Okay, so by definition, income segregation is saying that we're forming sort of more homogeneous, narrowly homogeneous neighborhoods or schools. And so through our interactions in those institutions, we might be less likely to interact with people different from ourselves, right? And we can think of a whole suite of hypotheses about the consequences of that. Okay, so I'd say overall, sort of the idea here is that there's a low chance, I'm using this in a loose term, of spillovers. And the closer you live or the more income mixing that you have in your local environments, the more sharing of resources we might see. And that could be formal tax dollars, but it could also be in terms of social resources. Okay, so just to come back then to this depiction of sorting, this is sort of a national view of what I showed you for Chicago. And what we have here is colored bars. Color changed on you, so now it's blue to red. But the basic trend here is that we used to have more neighborhoods that looked basically like the median income in their metropolitan area, and we've moved to a place in the about 2012. I should say this is American Community Survey data, so it's actually through 2014. Where we have many fewer neighborhoods that look like the median income in their metro area, and many more neighborhoods, or at least many more people living in neighborhoods that are affluent and poor. Okay, so again, thinking about children, this is for families in particular, so thinking about children, we're getting kids who are growing up in these sort of, less diverse neighborhoods and conferring differential advantages and disadvantage on those children. Okay, so let me move on then saying a little bit about data and management. I just want to keep time. Is there a clock? Or are you going to? I just want to.
That would give you 5 minutes.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Sorry, I didn't see a clock. Okay. Okay, so what we use to compute these measures are tract level census and American Community Survey data using family income. That's mostly what we've used in our work is family income because of this sort of motivation to think about children. Between 1970 and up to 2012. Okay, and we've really done this in two ways. So what I've shown you so far is one way that we've done this. And that's really just a description of neighborhood types. It's not really a segregation measure. It's really just saying we're coding neighborhoods to show it's very nice for visualization of differential neighborhoods on a map. And it's very intuitive, right? It sort of says these are affluent or poor neighborhoods, and it's based on median family income. Okay, but a lot of our work has also used an index of segregation. So we use the rank order information theory index, which is basically a summary measure of sorting within some unit. So it could be a metropolitan area, it could be a state, right? Whatever it is that you've chosen as your broader unit. Okay, and it's a little less intuitive, but it has some advantages. It's useful for comparing across metropolitan areas. It's useful for comparing changes over time. and it doesn't confound changes in income inequality with income segregation. Okay, so I'm going to say about 2 minutes on this, but then I want to move on to some results. So it's based on binned family income data, and I just want to say a note here on some bias corrections that we've been working on. The American Community Survey has a lower sampling rate than the census does, and sort of to back that up even another step, when we compute racial segregation, we do that generally from the full count census data. So we get everybody basically in a track, and so it leads to pretty precise estimates. Income data has always been derived from a sample, what used to be called the long form in the census, and now we have the American Community Survey, and those samples are smaller. So in the long form, it used to be 1 in 6, and that has gotten to be less in the American Community Survey and has bumped around a little bit as the American Community Survey has sort of gone through the 2000s. So because small sample sizes within census tracts can lead to upward bias and income segregation, we've been working on some corrections, which basically take into account the sampling rate within the tract as well as the sample sizes in the tract. And we've corrected, so we've sort of downward corrected our estimates. And let me show you what I'm talking about here. So here is a graph which basically just gives basic trends, and it's a naive estimate is the dotted line, and the thick line is our adjusted. So what you'll see is the adjusted is slightly lower than the naive estimate, but it tracks very closely. So basically our general conclusions are the same. We saw a slight decrease in income segregation in the 70s, a fairly large increase in the 80s, relatively little change in the 90s, and then a slight uptick in the 2000s. But what you'll notice is that in the 2000s, those lines are farther apart, meaning that the corrected estimates are lower than what the naive estimate would be because of that change in sampling. Okay, so what we worried about was that in the 2000s, what we were really seeing as an uptick was really just a change in the sampling. And it's about half as big is our estimate. Okay, so we see about a 4% increase in the 2000s. Okay, so from now on, I'm just going to show you adjusted estimates, but I wanted to tell you a little bit about that. But from now on, what I'll present are all using our adjustment. Okay, so this work began with Sean Reardon, and we were thinking, first we were interested in income segregation generally. We did some trends, and then we thought, okay, what are some big causes, right? Well, if this is changing over time, what else is changing over time? And an obvious sort of candidate for that was income inequality. And we started to think more carefully about how this shift in income inequality that was going on over the past, say, 45 years might be affecting how people actually sort in place. Okay, so this was sort of the motivation for our question, and so we very basically just looked at this correlation and we thought, well, okay, is there more, more narrowly causal story here? And on the left panel in purple, you just see the rise in income inequality. This is within metropolitan areas, okay, from 1970 to 2012. And on the right is our adjusted income segregation measure between families. Okay, and I should note this is for the largest 117 metropolitan areas. Okay, so we just looked at this and we thought these two big things were happening at the same time, and we tried to get some estimates about their association. So we've done a number of papers on this. We've looked from 1970 to 2000. We've looked from 1970 to 2009 when the new ACS data came out. And we've also done some work just looking in the ACS data from 2007 to, say, 2012. In all of those papers, we find a robust positive relationship between income inequality and family income segregation, net of secular trends and metropolitan fixed effects, basically, so stable between metro area differences. And so, cautiously on the causal front, but we think that it's plausible that income inequality is a primary driver of rising income segregation. And in fact, in the work that we did looking just at the two ACS points, we only saw an increase in income segregation in metro areas that had increases in income inequality. Okay, so certainly there are factors that I'm going to talk about later that lead to sort of baseline segregation, how we organize ourselves in terms of neighborhoods, political jurisdictions, right? But in terms of changes, we've seen this changing relationship between inequality and segregation. That's been fairly robust over a series of papers. Okay, so my next question then was, can we think a little bit more carefully about kids? Okay, and can we think a little bit more? We've been using families. Some families have children, some families don't. That's the way the census defines them. And Ann Owens did some nice work sort of splitting out that relationship between families with children and those without. And so going from that, I'm going to present a little bit of work looking at how that might be contributing to unequal contexts in school districts. Okay, so the roles of family and children. So this graph here is going to show you changes in income segregation for different populations. Okay, the purple line is the same thing I showed you before, which was for families. Families include, some families have children, some families don't. The black line is all households, so that can also be single people. And then the dotted lines, the short dots are households with kids, and the long dots are households without kids. Okay, so basically what you should take away from this is that family income segregation, as I told you, has gone up. But really that's been driven largely by households with children, okay? And in fact, households without kids have seen somewhat of a decline in income segregation. Okay, so what does this tell us? Well, it tells us that probably, as you would guess, people with kids care a lot about where they live because of the resources that we talked about earlier. They make choices based on things like public education system as well as environmental harms, right? All of these things that we think matter a lot for kids. Okay, but it also means that kids' environments are more segregated than adult environments, right? So we want to think then about, okay, they're in these sort of more segregated environments. How might that be represented in the environment, in the social context that they spend a lot of time in, namely schools? Okay, so what we set out to do, Ann Owens and I are working on this together, was to think a little bit about a thick description of unequal resources across the school districts of the average lower and higher income kids. So let me say a little bit about what we've done here. Generally, thinking back to the mechanisms through which income segregation operates, we say, okay, some school districts have more money than others, and we think maybe that creates resources or harms. But then we want to think, well, what kind of resources are we talking about, right? What kind of things is income correlated with that might matter for kids' outcomes? So we started thinking, where can we get some information on this? Because the Common Core of data on schools is limited. We have racial composition and free lunch composition, which is a proxy for poverty. But we don't have really a lot of other information about what's going on in these schools. And so we decided to try to use census data that's tabulated in school district boundaries to get a better sense on some of these mechanisms that we think are correlated or sort of that income segregation might be working through. Generally, when we think about how schools work, we kind of think there's the money pot and then there's the people pot of mechanisms. So we often think, how much do schools spend, right? We think about per pupil funding. We think about disparities in per pupil funding, in part because a lot of schools, school funding in the US is locally funded. So it's very variable, right, by tax base. But we also think that peers matter, right? So we think that the kinds of people you go to school with matter, but we actually don't have that much information about that except for racial composition and poverty composition. And we wanted to think a little deeper about what might be going on that we care about. Okay, so what we do is we estimate exposure. Before we think about segregation, we first just take the school districts within a state and we say, what does the average school district context look like for a lower and a higher income student on some of these social context variables? Okay, so what I'm going to show you today is just adult education. Okay, so we're going to look at the proportion of adults who hold a college degree, a four-year college degree, a BA or higher, as a social resource in school districts. We've also done this for unemployment as well as family structure. Okay, and we're going to say, what is the average low-income child experience in terms of that social context, and what is the higher income child experience? Okay, so we look at financial resources as well to sort of just compare what we know about financial resources. There's a lot of good research on this already, but we basically do our exposure measures as well and say, what's the average per pupil funding that a low-income child versus a high-income child experiences within a state? I'm not going to talk very much about that, but what I'm going to say is we've basically replicated other results by Kirabo Jackson and some other people that basically show that it's about even on average, that low-income kids on average receive about the same per pupil funding as high-income children on average. I want to say sort of a caveat is that I don't think anyone thinks that equal funding is enough to achieve equal outcomes because of exactly what we're talking about, the disadvantage of place. But in terms of a goal of school funding equalization, we've gotten somewhere close to that. But then we wanted to say, well, what about social resources? Because we're really not doing much but this is what we're talking about, the income segregation of people, right? And the resources that families and people bring to schools. So our contention is that the social context of schooling has been a theoretical but largely unmeasured mechanism through which income segregation might operate to create unequal opportunities for children. So what we're going to do is we're going to compute state-level gaps in the average school district context of higher and lower income children. We're going to do that in two ways. Okay, the first way is we're going to use the free lunch data available through the CCD, and that's largely what's been available to people, or at least what people have used, and that gives us a good proxy for poverty. You qualify for free lunch if a family is 130% of the poverty line or lower. And then non-free lunch, though, is sort of a blunt category of not poverty, basically. So what we've tried to do is we actually have used the census data tabulated into school district boundaries to approximate counts of children in deciles of the income distribution. And what that allows us to do is then look at exposure of more extreme affluence and poverty, which is really where a lot of the increase in income inequality has occurred. So we want to know the kids who are in the first decile versus the 10th decile, what does the average difference in their social context look like? Okay, and gets a little bit more of a grip on the inequalities by income that we're seeing. Okay, so what I'm going to show you is first, like I said, I'm just going to do this for adults with a bachelor's. Okay, and this is work in progress, but basically this is just descriptive. So this is overall state level exposure. So you can think about this as the average percent of adults with a BA in the school districts of a free lunch versus a non-free lunch child. Okay, so as you'd expect, sort of the non-poor kids on average have higher rates of adult education in their school districts than the children who are eligible for free lunch. And we see that for everybody that's grown over time, right, with the expansion of higher education. Okay, so everybody's getting more adults sort of higher education over time, but that gap has actually grown somewhat. So it's about a 3 percentage point difference over here and about a 5 percentage point difference over here. Okay, so there's more education returns going to higher income kids. Okay, but then I'm going to overlay the first and 10th decile. Okay, and what we see here is potentially, as expected, that kids who are in the top 10% of the income distribution have much higher exposure to adult education than other children. And in fact, the first decile maps pretty well onto free lunch data. So that's doing that sort of poverty measure is doing a pretty good job of capturing what we think of poverty. But this non-free lunch, what people often use as saying not poor, doesn't really do a very good job of capturing inequalities that are happening because of growth at the top. Okay, and so over here we're getting much larger gaps. Much larger gaps as you would expect between first and 10th decile kids. Okay, it's about 11 percentage point difference. Okay, so the baseline here is about 28% of adults in 2011 had a college degree or higher nationally. Okay, and so 11 percentage point difference is pretty different in terms of what the average school district looks like. Okay, so then we said, well, how does income segregation play into this, right? Do states that are more income segregated have bigger gaps, right? And I think we'd think yes, because we know that education is correlated with income, but we don't really know how much. So here's just a simple graph to show you income segregation in states. So this is income segregation between school districts within states. Okay, and 1990 is on the x-axis, 2011 is on the y-axis, so dots above there give you increases over time. Oops, sorry, I keep hitting the wrong button. So what you'll see is these states up here, New Jersey, Connecticut, Massachusetts, these are high income states, also high inequality states, high segregation states. Okay, these are also states that we tend to think have pretty good education systems, right, because they have high funding. But as you'll see, they're also the kinds of places that have big inequalities. Okay, so it kind of depends on how you want to measure opportunity. But here, the other point is just to say that there's vast variation across the states. Okay, places like Florida and Nevada have almost no income segregation between their school districts. I'll talk a little bit later about why that is in terms of the structure of their school districts. Okay, but these places have lots of small districts. They're very fragmented. Okay, so if you just look at the left panel, this is the free lunch comparison, and on the right is the 10th first decile comparison. But what we've simply done is broken up states into quintiles of segregation. Okay, and we've plotted those. And what you can basically see then is that the gaps are much bigger in highly segregated states, which is what you'd expect. And actually the gaps are about twice as big in the 10th and first decile versus the free lunch gap. Okay, and so these are the places where we're really seeing a confluence of sort of the highest level of inequality. This is places where there are kids that are from the very poorest and the very most affluent families attending school in the most segregated states, right? And we get these really big gaps, almost 20 percentage points between their average school district exposure to adult with a bachelor's. Okay, so what we're trying to do here is kind of get a grip on the mechanism through which income segregation might work, right? Maybe it's through parent education, maybe it's through unemployment levels, maybe it's through other social factors, and obviously using census data, we can't get all of the mechanisms we might like, right? Things like social norms. But we're starting to get some way of measuring some of these social gaps that our policies really aren't doing that much about. Right? I started by saying that we've done this same exercise using per pupil funding, and we actually see almost no relationship between the gaps in per pupil funding and segregation, okay, because we have a lot of policies in place that call for redistribution of funding, right, or school finance reform. Okay, we have very few policies. Larry is going to talk a little bit about some interventions that are trying to move people. But we have few policies that really en masse try to shift social resources. So as far as we think that social resources are part of the school story, right, we need to think about how much can we expect, right, in terms of equalization of outcomes from financial resources alone. Okay, so I'm going to take the last few minutes I have here to say a few concluding thoughts. Okay, I mentioned structure before, and so if we go quickly back here and we think, you know, what is it about some of these states that's different? Okay, I've done some work on political fragmentation. These tend to be states that have a lot of school districts, okay, also a lot of towns. You can think of other units, right? And so when you think about how we share resources within those political units, we get a lot of differentiation when we get a lot of small units. It allows for sort of more fine sorting, if you will. Okay, so in a lot of these very segregated states, we also have a lot of small units into which people sort. So that's one sort of underlying feature of our geopolitical space that might contribute to some of these patterns. In places like Florida and Nevada, we have county-based school districts. Okay, so what does that do? Well, they're diverse. Counties are much more diverse than tiny little municipalities. Right? So in Florida, we get almost no income segregation. Now, it's not to say that there's not other ways through which inequality occurs within school districts. Clearly, there's going to be variation within Miami-Dade County, for instance, in terms of the elementary schools. But when we think about the mechanism through which redistribution might happen, school districts have a lot more leeway to sort of maneuver within their boundaries than they do across boundaries, for instance, right? So the way the teachers get assigned to schools, the way the funding gets assigned to local schools, the district is really the unit through which taxes are collected, okay? Lots of other ways in which people contribute to individual schools, but just to say that this is why, in part, we see these big differences in income segregation, okay? I also, yes, yeah, okay, I am done. So what I've shown you today is that income segregation has increased over time, and that a big driver of that has been income inequality in terms of changes. I've also shown you that it leads to big social context differences in units that matter a lot for children, namely school districts. I tend to think about structural features, and so while inequality is something that's been moving, I've also talked about the structure of our school districts, fragmentation, okay, which is a way in which we've chosen to organize these units and a way in which we might think to remedy it. Obviously, those are the harder things to change. The other side of that is things to mitigate the effects of unequal outcomes, and I think Larry's going to talk more about that, so I will end there and give it over to Stephen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Bischoff. Next we have Stephen Durlauf. He's a professor of public policy at the Harris School at the University of Chicago as of this fall, formerly of Madison. His research spans many topics in micro and macro. He's made big substantive contributions to understanding poverty, inequality, and economic growth. You know, I think one of the main features of his work has been integrating ideas from sociology and sort of non-price-based social interactions into economics. and he's pioneered a lot of theoretical work and empirical work in this area. So we're really delighted to have you, and I'll be quiet and not list all of your many honors, but look him up. He has many.
Well, thank you for that embarrassingly nice introduction. So I feel like I'm the odd person out in the sense that I don't really do empirical work. And so what I wanted to do in this talk was to give you some sense of where economic theory is with respect to thinking about the relationship between segregation and inequality. And the focus that I want to give it is a phrase that's used in research in economics called social interactions. I thought that if you went first, I'd figure out how to use this by now.
It's the green button, big green one.
The big green button.
The big green button. Well, I'm colorblind. This is completely unreasonable. All right. So what I want to do is basically three things. First, I want to give you a very, very heuristic overview of what I think the big picture questions are that at least formal theorists have tried to address in integrating sociology and economics, which will speak to the segregation issue. Second, I want to talk through two formal models that have to do with the relationship between segregation and inequality. If you looked at the slides, I apologize. They are. I'm going to skip all of them. In other words, there's way too much algebra in them. What I want to do is communicate the ideas in them, and finally, I want to make a few comments on the relationship between this perspective on inequality and thinking about public policy, both positively and normatively. So I think that if my summary of the social interactions literature is the following, that is, it comes down to three propositions. The first proposition, and for those of you that are not economists, you have to remember that the holy trinity in economic reasoning is to specify three aspects of individuals and tautologically conclude that describes outcomes. And those three characteristics are to say people have preferences, they face constraints, and they have beliefs about the consequences of their actions. Things are uncertain, and therefore they have to somehow form beliefs about them. And so, by the way, when I say that to you, even if you're not an economist, you say, well, there's no content to it. Anything could be rationalized if I correctly specify these things. So the serious point is the following. And that is that when we think about the determination of what we mean by preferences or the constraints individuals face or the way that they think about the uncertainty in the world, that in each case there's a fundamental social component to that. In other words, that my preferences aren't just determined in isolation by what I consume. If I were to smoke cigarettes, for example, it matters whether my friends smoke. I get more utility from being similar to them. Similarly, the effort that I engage in school is more productive if others engage in hard work, and that would be a notion of a constraint. Similarly, the way that I think about the world is affected by how others think about the world. And so in each case, the social interactions approach takes seriously the social determination of these constituents of individual outcomes. Now, that said, what becomes important in the literature, of course, in the analysis, is the way that this dependence occurs. And there's a basic idea in economic theory called complementarity. What that means intuitively is that if you do something, that makes it look more appealing to me. So if my friends work harder, there are reasons why when I'm deciding how hard to work, and I'm not claiming adolescents are engaged in homo economicus rationality, but nevertheless they are in some sense adjudicating possibilities, weighing them, that it becomes more attractive to engage in that behavior. And so what complementarity does intuitively is it takes the basic logic of marginal cost equals marginal benefit, the guts of the implied decision-making of individuals, and creates a type of dependence. Now, why is this important? Because once one introduces this notion of complementarity, one actually has the constituent of a way of understanding why there would be group-level inequality. Put differently, once one thinks about decisions with this particular notion of social interaction, this notion of complementarity, one has a tendency for correlated behaviors within groups, and consequently, the logic of the analysis of inequality moves from strictly individual-specific analyses to ones that try to think about why groups would exhibit different levels of inequality. Now notice, and I will be more specific about this in a moment, I haven't said anything about what the groups are. Is it my friends? Is it my residential neighborhood? And we could obviously pursue that in thinking about some richer notion of social space. So that's idea number one, that the specification of individual decision making, what determines outcomes, has a particular type of social interdependence, and what that leads to are theories of group level inequalities. Idea number two is that when I refer very vaguely to this notion of group memberships, they themselves have aspects that are endogenous. In other words, they evolve in response to these social interactions. Now, clearly, some form of groups are when we think about gender or ethnicity, I'm not talking about their endogeneity, but if I'm thinking about social networks, or I'm thinking about residential neighborhoods, or the composition of colleges and the like, in each case, the fact that social interactions are present and matter to individuals, in turn, is generating a reason to understand the way in which the memberships themselves evolve. And so if you think about what I've set up, so implicitly, my first proposition would be some of the quote-unquote micro-foundations for the results that Larry's going to talk about in the context of MTO and other interventions. Idea number two is exactly what Kendra talked about. In other words, we observe certain levels of segregation, and we want to think about them as equilibrium phenomena, and equilibrium only in the tautological sense that that's what happened. And so it's going to be some interplay of the levels of inequality along different dimensions in a population, as well as the nature of the interdependencies, which are going to lead to individuals making choices that collectively produce certain levels of segregation. All right. So idea number one, there's these certain types of social interdependencies. Idea two, those types of social interdependencies create incentives for segregation. You put one and two together, and that becomes a theory of persistent income inequality, and become an intergenerational theory. And what I mean by that is if you think through the logic of this, let's be concrete with respect to residential neighborhoods, the level of cross-sectional inequality determines the level of residential neighborhood segregation. I'm going down one mechanism. The level of residential segregation, because of differential context, in turn replicates the inequalities of the parents in the children. And hence you have transmission of socioeconomic status from parent to offspring. But notice it is mediated by the degree of socioeconomic segregation. Now, when I put this on the table, am I somehow ruling out the significance of families? Of course not. What I'm trying to put on the table is a complementary perspective that focuses on the role of social structure and associated segregation in generating intergenerational persistence and hence immobility. Okay. And so if one said, well, there's dozens of formal theoretical papers on these types of, dozens is modest, hundreds of theoretical papers. These are the basic ideas they're trying to address. Now, what I want to put on the table here is that just make some observations. Is the first, and this is what I hope is the good faith effort, and that is, this is an approach in economics that is trying to, in a good faith way, integrate ideas from sociology into the logical formalism of economics. Just as empirical work on neighborhood effects, on social networks, etc., is, good faith efforts may not succeed, but they are good faith efforts to take ideas in sociology and meld them with the perspectives that economists have. And I think that's an extremely important development in thinking about inequality. The second comment is to recognize that these models do have certain deviations from what I'm going to call neoclassical modeling. And what I mean by that is not that there's some mysterious heterodox approach, but something else, and that is that much of the focus, if I talk about role models, peer effects, etc., those are not mediated by markets. After all, any economic model, you could say, has social interactions in it, but the neoclassical approach says that prices become the sufficient statistics to adjudicate how people interact. These models have much richer notions of interactions. The third comment is to emphasize that in the relationship between this theoretical perspective and empirical work, if we talk about group-level disparities, these are statistical regularities. They emerge from the interactions of individuals. They respect the heterogeneity and the agency, as it were, of the individuals in the populations. And so if I want to know why there are substantial differences in anything from labor force participation to cigarette smoking to interaction with the criminal justice system, these, as I said, these are purely statistical regularities that emerge from interactions of individuals. Now, I should, so what sort of phenomena have been modeled in this literature? I want to put 4 on the table, and I want to add 2, which should have been there, and I messed up in not listing them, and they're actually quite important. First example is to focus specifically on peer effects. In other words, much of this literature has taken as a psychological primitive that individuals like to behave like one another. And so models, for example, of understanding heterogeneity in cigarette smoking are very much driven by the notion that I'm more like, that I wish to be similar to my friends. A second example in this literature would be the formalize and the effort to try to understand what role models mean and their role, no pun intended, in determining socioeconomic outcomes. So if one makes the observation, as Avery and Hawksby did, Hawksby and Avery did, that there are thousands of high test score, high grade college senior or high school seniors that are, have very limited college applications, that's a statement, at least partially, and I think the reading of the literature that spawned reasonably says that says something about the role models and the information, the aspirations they're forming. That's going to be determined by the communities in which they function. Okay, a third example has already been talked about, which is social norms. There's different degrees of collective beliefs about that word, which economists are often not good at modeling, what people should do. In other words, that there's a normative aspect of behavior, and that's where social norms come in. Fourth example is clearly social learning. In other words, the idea that the information that I have about labor market outcomes depends on my social network. That would be one example. Another example would be that if I'm trying to understand the payoff to education, being that cognitively rational being called a high school senior, the serious point is it matters who I observe in my community. All of those are simply examples where that trinity I gave you, in each case, there's something about the socioeconomic, the social environment one functions in that's determining their, what those objects are. Now, I said I left two things out. What should be number 5 is public goods. What do I mean by that? If I talk about disparities in per pupil expenditures, that's a statement about political economy. In other words, when substantial resources are generated via local taxes, children depend on the distribution of parental incomes because of the fact that the political economy is dictating a certain generation of that public good. Similarly, if I want to understand disparities in crime rates, one of the issues is going to be the fact that the system becomes overloaded, so to speak. When crime rates go up, there's simply going to be fewer per citizen resources, and so you get another type of political economy dependence there. And so that's why I want to call that public goods. The final thing that's missing here is discrimination. And this is something to be sensitive to if you're interested in the theoretical literature. A lot of what I've talked about seems to be interior to the social groups. Discrimination is about how social groups interact with one another. And that is a fundamental part of the social interactions approach. All right, and so I emphasize that on the table. And just to play that out, if I wanted to understand how prejudices perpetuate themselves in a population, one of the things I have to think about is segregation. So in other words, so another story or another model I could write down is individuals start with prejudices. They make choices not to interact with the groups against which they feel these prejudices, and as a result, the prejudices don't get falsified. Now, there's a formal language for that. People start off with beliefs, they're false. If they don't get data to update them, they don't change them. And so again, you see the same flavor there? There's something social in the determination of prejudices in a population among adolescents. If they make choices as adults that segregate themselves, I have another type of persistence. It may not be intergenerational income. It's about the perpetuation of false beliefs. And so I put all of those on the table as types of social influences where one can, as I said, study them formally and think about the relationship between these objects as theoretical constructs and econometric or statistical analyses. All right, there's a plethora of cases in which people have talked about why social interactions can matter. They're everything from fertility, education, employment, health, language. I could give you a much longer list. Larry's going to give you the facts. I'm just giving you some labels, and so I'm not even going to touch that one any farther. Okay. What I want to emphasize in thinking about social interactions is, of course, that we have this dichotomy that I think is a principled one between endogenous groups and exogenous groups. Why do we use that jargon? And that is, if I want to have a theory as to why neighborhoods are the mechanism that is determining persistence between parents and offspring, it's not enough to say neighborhoods matter. I also have to explain why neighborhoods are disparate. And so the complete theory of inequality, in other words, has to have the two constituents that I started off with. Both there's social things that are important, and there's something about the social structure that's inducing disparity. And so neighborhoods, firms, and schools are three standard examples of that. And just as Kendra talked about increasing segregation in residential neighborhoods, there's also evidence of that for colleges, and there's some evidence about skills and segregation by skill in firms, and all of that are things to think about. In other words, that on each of these dimensions, there's empirical evidence of increasing segregation, and what I wanted to put on the table is ways, at least conceptually, to think about that. And at the end of the day, they come down to this idea that complementarity actually creates incentives for segregation. That's the so-called Gary Becker marriage model was the initial example of that. And so once you have these incentives there, you can set up an environment and ask, given a certain level of inequality, some incentives for heterogeneity, some incentives for homogeneity. How do these things play out? Increasing inequality will logically entail increased segregation. That becomes one of the key factors in these types of analyses. Obviously, ethnicity and gender are fundamental in thinking about group level inequality. The reason that I split these off is to emphasize that the theories that focus on these types of groups don't have to have a theory of group formation. In other words, the groups themselves are natural kinds given the history of the United States, and so one proceeds accordingly. All right, so what I wanted to do, how am I doing on time? Poorly, undoubtedly. Oh my gosh, I think you missed 10 minutes. All right, so I think what I want to do next is sort of talk you through a little bit of algebra, and I apologize for that, but I promise it'll be just a little bit. Okay. What I want to say is the following, and that is that if we think about kind of individual specific explanations, basically I'd say there's some outcome, some choice. Not all choices are conscious. For example, if you wanted to ask what the probability I'm a Democrat versus a Republican, I can model that, even though I didn't sit down and say this is consciously what I'm going to do. But I would think about the outcome, this omega, there's some constraints I face. That's the possible values I can take on. And there's going to be two types of heterogeneity, things that explain me. And the way that I'd want to think about that is to say that whatever it is that I do, my omega, it depends on these two, I'm calling the two types of heterogeneity. If I'm doing, why do I want to call it two types? Because some heterogeneity is observable and some's unobservable. I'm calling the X as observable. Everybody with me? Now, why would I want to say it that way? That's the conventional model of choice in economics. When we talk about social interactions models, what we're doing is no more than saying people make choices. As I said, this is the tautology that I think of the choices, the outcomes as maximizing something that's consistent with my preferences. But what's different is that I think about the set of explanations in a richer fashion. It's not just things that are indexed by me. If you want to predict whether I go to college, you want to know whether my parents went. You want to know other things. You want to know about the community that I grew up in. That would be wise characteristics of the adults in the neighborhood that I grew up in. The other thing you'd like to know is what my friends do. Those are the other omegas. And so the upshot is that I would just think of each of the observations, the outcomes of individuals, as, again, maximizing something. That's not the interesting part. It's what matters is what I think determines those choices. In this case, it would be characteristics that are specific to me, things about my parents. Whys, those would be things about the parents, the adults in the community I grew up in. This fancy term mu, which is just a statement that I think about what my peers are doing. And then, of course, what I call the unobserved heterogeneity. Now, that equation actually encodes all of the econometric problems, the identification problems. Now, what do I mean by that? One question you could ask is if I have data, and by the way, when I say an identification problem, in other words, can the data reveal something? It depends on what I'm asking the data to reveal. I want to reveal the effect of a policy intervention that's a certain type of object, empirical object of interest. A different object would be, can I disentangle whether or not it's role models that affect me versus the choices of my friends to go to college or not. That's what Chuck Mansky called the reflection problem, and it is a species of the classical simultaneous equations problem in econometrics. Okay, but that's one of the questions is asked. If I have this abundance of riches, different social explanations, under what conditions can I disentangle the particular mechanisms? And so I'll put the example, a contemporary peer group effect versus a role model effect. Everybody with me? So that's one example. And that's encoded in the equation, and I tell whether the x's, the y's and the mu's are different. A separate example would be, what about these epsilons? In other words, when I think about social interactions and groups are endogenous, if I see a group of people that are smoking and a group of people that aren't smoking, did the peer effects lead people to smoke? Or, contrary, do smokers tend to be friends with each other? That's the self-selection issue. And of course, there are ways to think about that. The third example would be whether or not these epsilons have common effects. So if I were looking across classrooms and I saw the children with similar distributions of family characteristics, the classrooms have very, very different outcomes. Well, one explanation would be the social one. In other words, there's a reinforcement of high effort in this classroom, a reinforcement of low effort in another classroom. That one sounds nice and theoretically, I tried to say that's a great explanation, isn't it? But all the parents in the room have another explanation. It's called the quality of the teacher. And so the serious point is that if you're going to segue from the theoretical model to the statistical analysis, one has to ask a plethora of questions. They're all derived from this. Can I somehow disentangle the mechanisms when I can observe things? I know who the role model, stuff about the role models. I can observe the behavior of peers, etc. A second question is, how does the self-selection, the endogeneity of social structure interfere with the ability to disentangle purely social effects from individual effects? And the third is, how do I think about unobserved heterogeneity, which has some sort of social characteristic to it? All right. So, the reason the formalism, if you might say, why have the formalism? First, it has to do with logical coherence. And I want to understand, is it the case that increasing inequality under what conditions does it produce increasing segregation and increasing disparity, not just segregation, but increasing disparity of neighborhood exposures, and under what circumstances will that self-correct or not? That's where the logical formalism helps us. That's point number one. I'm making the case for why I do algebra. The second point is that in thinking about these identification questions, what it is that data can or cannot reveal, again, the algebra lets us work these things out with precision. All right, so what I want to say about the theories of social interactions is they have three properties that are interesting. Now, what I mean by that is that I've been focused on saying this is how we think about individuals. They make one set of choices that are, whether to work hard or not, that depend on things about their social environment, characteristics of it. A second was to say there are choices about the social environment. With reference to thinking about poverty as an aggregate phenomena, though, I'm interested in the second object, which is what I'm calling the equilibrium. And that's just jargon to say individuals make choices, but when I want to know about the poverty rate, it's the collection of individuals. And so I want to make some comments about what these models say about the equilibrium we would see in residential neighborhoods to make things concrete. One idea in these models is they exhibit multiple equilibria. What that means is that I can observe a collection of individuals if I sort of know how they make decisions. In other words, I have a description of how the way in which choices are made. If I know the characteristics of the individuals, does that tell me what they're going to do collectively? To say there are multiple equilibria, to say actually no. There's more than one configuration in a community consistent with the same description of the individuals. So what does that mean? Well, intuitively, suppose my choices in life, I want to be exactly the same as Aaron, and Aaron wants to be exactly the same as me in terms of whether we worked hard or we don't work hard. That's a very strong form of social dependence. But if you think about it for a moment, that gives a degree of freedom in what happens. After all, what I just said to you is, the only thing you can tell me about Aaron and I is we're going to do the same thing. It doesn't tell us what we're going to do. That intuition carries over to much richer environments. In other words, strong social interactions, strong dependences create this degree of freedom where a given configuration of individuals may have very different outcomes depending on the way in which the interactions lead to collective resolution in terms of the joint distribution of behaviors. Now, what's going to determine which one of these possibilities occurs? Well, there are theories about that. I think, for what it's worth, that in the empirical context for inequality, it has to do with historical contingency, not something economists can model. But I put on the table that's a very important idea. Let me add, by the way, that to say there are multiple equilibria is neither blaming the victim, or is it does it have any normative significance? What I mean by that is the following. If I think about two neighborhoods, and I said to you, this neighborhood is at a high equilibrium, and then I have a different neighborhood and it's at a low equilibrium, there's no notion that there's any choice involved. It's simply, as I said, it's a matter of historical contingency. That's point number one. Point number two is that in talking about how social influence can create this potential for very different outcomes, that's true when individual incentives are weak. What do I mean by that? If I said to you Beverly Hills High School has a high graduation rate because the Beverly Hills students have coordinated on the high graduation equilibrium, you would probably laugh at me. What you would say to me is the incentives to graduate from high school are so high that whatever social factors there are at Beverly Hills High School are such that they swamp them, and so you get a high graduation rate. If I said to you, in contrast, disadvantaged schools can exhibit multiple equilibria, what I'm really saying is that the private incentives are weak because of labor market possibilities, because of access to jobs, because of the neighborhoods, social networks, and the like, that because the private incentives are weak enough, that gives more scope for the social factors to create self-consistent bunching. And so the point on multiple equilibria is that they actually have this important interplay with the weakness of private incentives. And I think that's an important message. So we ask about why we see disadvantage in certain communities. It's not simply it's going to be the interplay of the social factors and the private factors and this potential for multiple equilibria. Second point I want on the table is these models exhibit something called social multipliers. What that means is that if I'm setting the incentives for individuals and I start changing those incentives, they ripple through the social structure. So if you wanted to affect me, give him something and I'll imitate him. Now, these social multipliers matter in these models because they actually create a lot of nonlinearity. Now, why is that a big deal? Because it says that if you're deciding how much to invest, scale matters. If I've invested X amount and the data tell me this is the consequence, there's a question about the extrapolation to 2X. And again, that's a message I want to have for policymakers, which is if you take these types of environments seriously, except for non-generic, if you'll forgive me, linear cases, they are profoundly nonlinear. And multiple equilibria, in fact, a manifestation of a certain deep nonlinearity. The third comment I want to make is these models exhibit something called phase transition. Okay, well, what's that mean? What it means is the following, and that is that you can actually get qualitative changes in environments around certain thresholds for values. There's a classic example of this from almost half a century ago by Thomas Schelling. It's a segregation model. And so the idea would be that in segregation models, you'll have these threshold effects where if individuals exhibit a certain level of preference for, or whites exhibit a certain level of preference for living with a majority whites, communities tip over into being completely segregated. This type of property happens in these models because essentially what's going to happen is there's a subtle interplay of the social and the private incentives, and if the social incentives become strong enough, suddenly multiple equilibria emerge. Or if the private incentives become strong enough, suddenly multiple equilibria disappear. And so one's extremely interested in those types of values. And I'm going to say, what's that mean in the real world? That's what it would mean for a community to exhibit a qualitative change in social disorganization. That can actually be mathematically modeled. All right. So this is a bunch of algebra, which I promised you I would skip. And I'm skipping it. I want credibility. What the first model says is the following, and that is if I want to understand whether or not a community exhibits multiple equilibria, is it in a trap, a low outcome trap of some type, it's actually going to have to do with the interplay of three things. One are the incentives that people collectively face. Everybody in a community has a high incentive because of good social networks. The second thing is the strength of the social interactions. Communities in which there's very strong solidarity actually can tip in both, they can tip to good things, they can also tip to bad things. The third thing is that heterogeneity intrinsically works against multiple equilibria. Now, why do I want that on the table? When you segregate individuals, you delimit, that implicitly delimits heterogeneity, and that means that individuals can much more easily tip into one group versus another. In other words, heterogeneous communities mean that no matter what I do, I can find peers, or I can find people that are similar to me, that I conform to. In homogeneous communities, you don't have that. And so, again, I think part of what the mathematics tells us is there's a complex interplay of common incentives, purely heterogeneous, the heterogeneity of individuals, as well as the intensity of the social incentives. And I think that's an important message. Right? And all of this can be econometrically implemented. It's not theory in isolation. The way that these models are constructed, they actually have direct econometric analogs. Okay. Now, the second model I'm going to talk about tomorrow at the next conference. And so that was an intergenerational Great Gatsby curve. But let me just, I promised you I'd skip everything, so how do I go back? All right. There's a lot of talk about something called the Great Gatsby curve, and it's the idea that there's a positive relationship between inequality and immobility. That's been, the curve itself was a description of the OECD that's cross-sectional. What I mean by an intertemporal Gatsby curve, I've actually already outlined for you. If I have a vision of the formation of neighborhoods, for example, in which the way the world works, as it were, is when you increase inequality, that increases the incentives for residential segregation. Why? Because of political economy, the nature of public finance, because of the nature of social interactions, etc. In that world, increasing inequality begets increased segregation, begets lower mobility. And so I put that on the table that one can see exactly how what looked like very abstract theorizing can come up with a very concrete description of mobility inequality dynamics. The comment I want to add here is it turns out that it's very important to think about whether economies are growing or not. That sounds strange. And that is that if we think about an economy that's growing, it turns out that that's an environment that can exhibit much less mobility than a stationary economy. Why is that? Because in growing economies, what the social interactions do, they alter the growth rates of different types, rich and poor. Well, if the rich and poor can grow at different growth rates in this growing environment, it's like a cone as to what the possible incomes are. You can actually show that it's possible that there's never any reversal of relative status. One of the things about stationary environments is eventually the shocks reverse everybody. In growing environments, that doesn't happen. And I think that's an important message in thinking about the sort of distributional growth curves that Piketty, Saez, and Zuckman have generated, et cetera. So again, there's another message there, the segue from the theory to at least some thinking about the real world. Okay, I think I'm out of time, so I'm going to skip the public policy stuff, and let me just leave it there. Thanks for your attention.
I know Stephen's onto something because, in fact, I do want to be just like you. So I have the pleasure to introduce our final speaker on the panel, Lawrence Katz. Professor Katz is a professor of economics at Harvard. With apologies to Eddie Lazier and Derek Neel and other luminaries we have in the room, I'd argue that Professor Katz maybe has done more than anyone else to shape the field of labor economics over recent decades. He's been the editor of the Quarterly Journal of Economics for many years, the chair of the Labor Economics Program at the National Bureau of Economic Research, chief economist of the Department of Labor in the early 90s, and again, has made tremendous contributions across economics. So we're delighted to have you here, and I won't eat up any more of your time.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that generous introduction, and want to talk a bit today about the confluence of two recent, I think, good trends in the social sciences, the growth of use of big data, as we saw in Kendra's talk, particularly administrative tax data being able to be linked up to other data to give us a real good sense at finer geographies of differences in mobility, and the use of randomized control trials or social experiments to try to get at causal factors to test some of the overall big picture issues of the role of segregation on individuals' outcomes, particularly kids' outcomes, and potentially to shed some light on the mechanisms of the type that Steve talked about. And so the work I'm going to talk about is, given its big data and large, is with a bunch of different scholars. And I'll try to mention them, but I'm sure I will forget some of the co-authors as we go on. So to start, I want to talk about looking at upward mobility for kids, the possibility that if you are growing up in poverty or in the lower part of the distribution, that you move up in the next generation. And we know that you have much less chance of ending up well off if you start out in a low-income family. But what we're learning is that the nature of this context and environment, which metro area, what census tract, what county you grow up in, seems to be extremely strongly related, even conditioning on your parents' income. It's not just that poor people live in poor areas and poor people do worse, but conditioning on your parents' income, there's a lot of differences in the likelihood that you'd end up in a higher income place as an adult. And we now have very fine measures from the work of my colleague Nathan Hendren and his obscure co-author Raj Chetty, linking all the children born in the United States in the early 1980s, and we now are going to be able to do this for kids born in the 60s and 70s and going on as well, from increased access to the tax data and linking to census data, and looking at how they did as young adults based on where they grew up. And it's led to a lot of pretty maps. One interesting one here shows you for kids growing up in the bottom fifth, and if you'd done this for the bottom half, you'd get a very similar sort of pattern, what their likelihood of making it, the real American dream to the top fifth. If what your parents' income didn't matter, this should look like 20%, for everyone. But of course, we know there's going to be a lot of heterogeneity that's going to matter. But what you see is there substantial variation in the U.S. in the amount of upward mobility for kids growing up in low-income families, ranging from those red areas, less than 5% of kids in a poor family end up in the upper quarter, or maybe the average kid in the bottom half ends up in the 30th or 40th percentile of the distribution, whereas in areas like the San Francisco Bay Area, but also areas like parts of Iowa, North Dakota, parts of Minnesota, a much higher fraction, sort of 3 times as many, Salt Lake City, end up moving up, or sort of 50-60% end up, at 50th, 60th percentile, a typical kid in the bottom half versus 30 or 40th. So parts of the U.S. Have upward mobility, to take that Great Gatsby curve analogy, that look a lot like Scandinavia, or at least like Canada. Canada has much higher upward mobility than the US. So one thing we're learning is that that's true at the metropolitan area. It's also true, let's take the Twin Cities area, if you break this down into counties, even within, we saw Minneapolis was about 8.5%, a little better than the national average. There are huge differences. If you grow up in Minneapolis itself, in many places, it doesn't look that different from the South, whereas there are other more suburban counties where the rates, look like Canada or Scandinavia. So even within the Twin Cities area, there's sort of more than 2-to-1 differences. And if you break this down into census tracts, there are huge differences going on even within Minneapolis. And so we know there are very large differences, not just in where kids grow up, but in what their outcomes are based on that. Big question is, does that have anything to do with these neighborhood environments themselves, or is that just different types of people? Maybe the two, poor families, the parents who have the same income, who really are much more willing to invest in their kids' education, move, scrap together, move to a different type of environment. How much of this is just heterogeneity, and how much of this is the causal effect of those neighborhood environments and the types of social factors that Steve talked about? And what I want to focus on is attempts to try to get at what are the causal consequences of place from 2 sorts of research strategies. One which started with work by a number of years ago at someone at the Chicago Federal Reserve Board, Daniel Aronson, looking at differences among siblings who spent different amounts of time in different locations using the National Longitudinal Survey, suggestive evidence that among 2 siblings, the one who spent more time in the better neighborhood or better high school ended up doing better. But very small samples. What if we could do this with sort of every move in the United States for kids growing up in the 80s? Work that Raj Chetty and Nathan Hendren have done, looking at over 5 million moves and being able to compare sort of siblings and across areas. How does that link up to this sort of map? And the second, even when you're doing that, you still worry. I think Less so given the sample size and stuff. Maybe, parents knew one kid was really going to be more terrific and moved at a time to sort of place them there. I think. But we can actually use a true randomized experiment, which I've been working on for the last 25 years, the Moving to Opportunity experiment, where 5,000 American families in some of the highest poverty areas of the US in the mid-1990s were randomly given vouchers and help to move to lower poverty, higher opportunity areas. And we've been tracking those families with surveys and with administrative data over time. And I think we have a rich picture on what it meant to the parents and what it's meant to the kids over time. And what's striking is very similar findings from the large-scale, non-experimental, quasi-experimental, that where you grew up as a kid and what it looks like from this previous map is highly correlated with your long-run outcomes. Kids who grow up in those green areas do much better, and that's even true within family, and it looks like sort of causal effect. And similarly, in the experiment, we find this, but it really depends when you move. The longer exposure at younger ages to areas that seem to have higher upward mobility, the better for the outcome. And when you move as an adult, neighborhoods really matter, but it's going to matter a lot more for your mental health and well-being and for your kids' outcomes, less so for your labor market outcomes. So this is going to give us some suggestion of the mechanisms having to do with things that affect health and labor market outcomes, and whether the role of school environments and other factors. So the first is to complement the sort of raw data on upward mobility. One can look at all the moves across counties in the US, and on ongoing work, one can also do this at the census tract level and basically look at, if we compare the kids who grew up in an area and don't move and how well they're doing, do movers in at different ages get part of that premium if it's a good area, or deficit in a poor area relative to growing up in another location? And does that even happen within families? And the answer is, strikingly, it appears that the years of exposure in a better neighborhood sort of proportionally seem to affect your outcomes if you move as a kid, but not if you move as an adult. So what I want to show here is one particular move of someone who's actually in the data, who grew up in the Twin Cities area, born in Bloomington, Nathan Hendren, my colleague, who has analyzed it. We can't reveal his data point, but he sort of was born in Bloomington and moved at the age of 9 to Waconia. The typical kid in this cohort born in Bloomington earned $30,000 when you observe them, as a young adult in their mid-20s, and the typical kid in Waconia earns $40,000. I'm sure Nathan, even as a junior faculty member of Harvard, probably did better than the $40,000 on that. So if you move at age 9, basically what the analysis of the moves done by Raj, Chetty, and Hendren says is you basically get, if you observe the people who move then, they get about 54%, sort of half of their childhood spent area. They seem to get about 54% of the difference between the people who spend all their childhood in Waconia versus all their childhood in Bloomington. And if you look at this, we don't have enough data in Waconia and Bloomington to do this, but if you take all the places in the US and we have, hundreds of thousands of observations in each one of those dots to look at similar sort of looking places, what you strikingly find is this sort of almost linear looking relationship between the years of exposure in a better area and your long run outcomes up through, and this is the age at which your age when your parents move. So these are parents moving, we're linking them through tax data. But if your parents move in your 20s, you don't seem to get anything out of it, suggesting part of this, there seems to be some effect even if your parents are moving in your early 20s, which is some selection within this move, but this exposure time, we're taking out the fixed effect that parents that move from Bloomington to Waconia are just different, and we're using the exact timing of the age at which you move, and you can do the same thing within sibling pairs. So it's certainly suggestive that childhood exposure to better areas seems to have causal impacts on their long-run economic outcomes. This is true for earnings. It's true for whether you go to college. It's true for whether we observe you having a child out of wedlock, at least for women, where we can measure this linking the tax data to birth certificates, at least to the extent that there isn't a father listed on the birth certificate. So all those things seem to go together with your neighborhood environment. So suggested that there are sort of two ways to think about changing the types of neighborhoods that low-income kids are in. One is to try to directly change those neighborhood environments themselves through place-based policies, things like empowerment zones, things like the types of resources to schools of school finance equalization policies that were discussed, and that may be one path. The other is to actually try to help people move to these better areas, to recreate those types of moves, and that we do have in the US housing vouchers, which in principle are mobile as well as more directly place-based types of housing assistance. And we are currently starting some work trying to look at these place-based ones. There's a lot of, what you can show from past work is that you can certainly, there's certainly certain investments that make a place better. Areas that got empowerment zones that had a bunch of tax credits, others seem to end up with residents doing better a decade later. But what we don't know from historical work on that is, did they get better for the existing residents or not? Or are we just churning in, we build a bunch of things, we change the nature of jobs, and the existing residents got displaced, and a bunch of other people who would have done better move into those areas. So something we are going to be doing is linking the tax data to historical, place-based policies like empowerment zones, Hope 6 revitalization of public housing projects, things like the Harlem's Children's Zone, Kalamazoo Promise, and linking, those to the tax data to actually observe what happened to the people who were the original residents. Do they benefit from these changes in neighborhood environments? Do place-based policies actually affect the people they were trying to, or are they just musical chairs of which different areas are doing? So that's one approach to research. One clue as to the things that might matter is, what are the correlates of these causal effects of upward mobility across areas? Well, there's a very strong linkage in how well kids from low-income families do with the degree of residential segregation, both by income that Kendra showed us. There's a large variation in growing, and in racial residential segregation. Both of them are strongly negatively related across counties or metro areas in the upward mobility. The second is this Great Gatsby curve. There is a relationship to inequality, but it's actually not much relationship between how much the top 1% is doing at the metro area. A lot of this seems to be, do you have a large and thriving middle class, which also lines up a lot with historical work Claudia Golden and I have done on things like the high school movement. Areas that had, sort of strong middles of the distribution tended to invest more in school quality and creating access, and you see similar patterns here across areas. Areas, again, with more stable family structure, even for kids living in single female-headed households, do better in areas where there's a larger fraction of longer-term couples. That doesn't mean that's the causal mechanism, but it's clearly an indicator. Areas with more associations and relationships, whether you use Putnam measures or just add up the number of these participation in community organizations, seem to do better, and school quality is also strongly related to these areas. So those seem to be the types of factors that are very robust correlates that place-based policies probably should be thinking about. So the next thing I really want to focus on is the other strategy of, can we actually, if we provide resources and some help, and this is going to very much link up to the discussion this afternoon. Many of the, some reasons that people end up in higher poverty areas are purely income. They don't have enough money, but there are some opportunity bargains of housing you could afford in areas with greater upward mobility. And but there are also a lot of historical barriers, from redlining, exclusionary exclusionary zoning, other factors that have prevented from landlords unwilling to take a chance on families that might look different. And so even though we spend $45 billion a year on affordable housing, of which a substantial component is vouchers that are mobile, most of those vouchers and most of the place-based units we develop are in these low opportunity, high poverty areas. And about 20% to 30% of all families with vouchers and in low-income areas are churning across units from year to year. So there are a lot of moves, but most of those moves are not changing the environment their kids face. They're moving, someone like Matt Desmond has done a lot through evictions, a lot are sort of reactionary moves to something else. Can we potentially help people at, given they're doing a lot of move churning, think back and provide resources and help to move to areas that might do better for their kids, and maybe if it's done at the micro, small level, not generate all the switch and tipping phenomenon that Tom Schelling and others did. If we're in a world, there is some growing evidence where the tipping rate might not be one family per minority family in an area, given the share of poor families, you could imagine an equilibrium changing where it was less unequal where people live, where everyone would have a more diverse neighborhood and not feel uncomfortable. We aren't going to have the general equilibrium effects of what if we did moving to opportunity at huge level and what the moves in other areas, but I think there's growing evidence from other stuff that the range we're sort of talking about, it's unlikely we would be undoing the current sorting. Hopefully it would not be like one black family moves to Levittown and other things, completely change, but we can't, what we certainly do is we didn't see that in the areas we move families through in these types of problems. So what is the causal evidence I'm going to talk about? It was an experiment, randomized control trial started in the early to mid 1990s by the US Department of Housing and Urban Development. It came out of a very particular moment in late 1992 following the Rodney King Los Angeles riots, when for a brief moment Congress's attention was focused on issues of concentrated poverty, segregation, and passed an urban bill, and buried in that urban bill was the authorization both for what became empowerment zones early in the Clinton administration and some demonstration funding, which I remember going to early morning meetings at 7:30 a.m. in 1993 with Henry Cisneros and a number of staffers of HUD and people like Bruce Reed and Gene Sperling from the White House. I was the Labor Department's representative as the chief economist of the Labor Department at that time, trying to think about were there ways we could use this demonstration money to really look at whether neighborhoods matter and whether helping people move could make a difference. And out of that came the Moving to Opportunity experiment, which had been pushed by, as far back as the earlier Bush administration, and then HUD Secretary Kemp had really pushed for something like this, but had never taken off until the funding was provided in 93. A lot of it pushed by Senators Bill Bradley and Daniel Patrick Moynihan at the time. So what was Moving to Opportunity? It was open to families living in high poverty, greater than 40% poverty, public housing projects in 5 cities: Boston, New York, LA, Chicago, and Baltimore. So think the Robert Taylor homes, think about Cabrini Green, think about parts of East Baltimore where we've had a lot of issues. In those areas, the waiting list to get a housing voucher, although people are living in public housing, which by many was preferred, was often 8 to 10 years. Often it would be a decade before the list would open. So what Moving to Opportunity did is it created an extra 1,000, 1,500 vouchers in each one of these areas, and we used essentially a random assignment lottery to allocate them. Basically, for families interested in moving, so these were volunteers, about a third of the people in the eligible unit sort of showed an interest and signed up. One group was lotteried to what we call an experimental voucher, which could only be used to move to a low poverty area, under 10% as of the 1990 census, and they were given help, comprehensive mobility services. The other got a regular Section 8 voucher with no additional resources or restrictions, and the third group continued receiving their support. And a first question is, could low-income families living in high poverty areas actually move to to low poverty areas and how much more difficult. And then we actually found that 47% of the experimental families were able to move initially within the first year, within the 6 months to 4 months they had to lease up into low poverty areas. So there was an experiment. People did move. In contrast, even people with unrestricted Section 8 vouchers have a lot of trouble moving out of public housing or moving on. Only 60% of that group, and that's not that different than national averages. And some of these housing markets, were really tight by the mid to late 90s, like Boston or New York. Los Angeles was much easier to sort of move. And many of them, like in Baltimore, talk radio went up as this was going on. Somehow they got a hold of it. And in fact, there was going to be a second round of MTO, which got killed. Barbara Mikulski, a senator from Maryland, faced a lot of pressure over this issue because of the Baltimore one. So the issues of race and poverty and mobility are still ones that were striking in the mid-90s. So this is in New York City. If you took the modal area in which families were coming on, think about a public housing project like the one on the bottom. That's the King Towers in Harlem. That was the largest sending sort of area. Where did families with Section 8 vouchers move? They moved substantial distance, but think about moving from a 50% to plus poverty area to sort of a 25%. That's much higher than national average, but it's very different. An area like Soundville, whereas the experimental group is moving to areas closer to Westchester. Wakefield was sort of a modal area. Don't think of super rich area, think of a street looking, like the others, but it's sort of, a working class, middle class, sort of less economically segregated. Often they were, for African Americans, they were black middle class areas, and for Hispanics, they tended to be less racially segregated, but they were, and you shouldn't think of, even though the restriction was to a 10% poverty rate, you should think of families moving to an area that probably had a 15% poverty rate, because the 10% poverty rate was 1990, they're moving in 1996. Where can you afford with a Section 8 voucher to move that was a 10% poverty rate in 1990? Well, it's the one where that was probably a bit of a blip, but that's way different than your public housing project. So what is the nature of where over the next 18 years these families lived? If we look at compliers, the people who moved in the experiment, over the next 18 years, they're basically living typically in areas with poverty rates between 10 and 20%, whereas the control group is basically living in places with 50% poverty rates, which is like 3 standard deviations over the national average. And essentially almost no one in the control group is living in areas under 10% poverty, and a substantial fraction of people in the experimental. And the Section 8 group is somewhere in between, looking more like typical moves, still high poverty areas, but not as concentrated poverty as the areas that control group. What did this mean for outcomes over the, following them up over time? What's interesting is it's going to look a lot like those exposure things. Moves as kids really mattered for economic outcomes, but moves for adults mattered less. So repeatedly we found, and this was often the headline that was reported, even though the world was much subtler, not much impact on adult economic outcomes. This is about as small a treatment effect as you can find. That's following the adults with administrative UI data over the next 11 years. And you tell me which is the experimental, the Section 8 and control group. Yes, there was a blip in 1 year when we did the interim report, where the red line was slightly and blue line were slightly above that, which you might have thought was this. But basically, there's no impact on the employment or earnings of the adults that we found at any point of time. So theories of spatial mismatch, that for adults, the exact neighborhood you live in through social networks or access to jobs were the driving forces in their economic outcome differences. This was not a powerful enough intervention to change that, and they really did change the types of neighborhoods they lived in. But didn't mean it wasn't meaningful to the adults' lives. We found very large 1 year out, 7 years out, 15 years out changes in health. So neighborhoods really do matter for health. Large reductions in stress, obesity, diabetes, reductions in depression, and big increases in psychological subjective well-being. So we call this moving to tranquility. for adults, but maybe not moving to economic opportunity. The change in happiness is about, pretty close to the black-white, for example, happiness gap that's found in the data. What about the kids? Initially, things didn't look so great for the kids. Test scores weren't affected very much. When we were looking at the older kids who move, we weren't finding much on their economic outcomes. But if something takes 10, 20 years to have 10 or 20 years of exposure, it takes 10 or 20 years. So based on the quasi-experimental stuff that Niraj Chetty and Nathan Hendren did, we got permission to link the MTO data to IRS administrative tax data to follow the younger kids into adulthood and look at their outcomes. And what we found was something quite striking that looked a lot like the quasi-experimental moves. Kids in the experimental group had sort of 30% higher earnings when we see them in their 20s than kids in the control group. The Section 8 looks about halfway in between. They were more likely to go to college. They are living in higher quality neighborhoods, lower poverty, and they're less likely to be single parents. And they're paying more in taxes, receiving less in benefits, so taxpayers are benefiting from this change. And you wouldn't have seen that before we had the tax data. When we're looking at them at ages 20 and stuff, they're more college. It's only when you start seeing them more moving into adulthood. And so we find a lot of data, both from experimental and quasi-experimental, that childhood exposure really affects economic outcomes. And there's other recent work using demolition of Chicago public housing by Eric Chin, finding very similar findings from people who left places like Robert Taylor Homes and Cabrini Green and moved to, not as good neighborhoods as MTO, but much better neighborhoods in terms of their finding. And it doesn't appear that this is just an income effect of having a voucher, because the people are getting the same income support in public housing. And when we have lotteries for vouchers that don't involve neighborhood moves, for example, the Chicago public housing lottery that allowed thousands of families to essentially reduce their rent payments but stay in the same locations, we find very little impact on their kids' outcomes. So the neighborhood environment beyond family income here, there are no changes in MTO and parents' income, so it's clearly telling us something about a neighborhood exposure effect. And the other interesting thing is we weren't finding much going on when they were adolescents, not a lot in test scores. If you really push this, the girls were sort of healthier and happier as teenagers, the boys not much of anything. What are the sort of interim indicators that seem to be driving this? It looks a lot more like things that you see test score fade out in a lot of early childhood interventions, things that are showing up in some of the behavioral non-cognitive measures. One we actually did do is we did voice recordings in the long-term survey. And when we worked with a linguist, John Rickford at Stanford, who works on African American vernacular English versus standard American English, and we sort of tried to develop a methodology of using phrases when you could switch between and look at the kids and the adults who were in the experimental group versus the control group for African Americans, who were about 55% of the sample. And what we found is that was one interim thing that really changed. That's not saying language itself mattered, but very much sticking with work that people like Eddie Lazier have done on assimilation and sort of immigrants. That was sort of an interim finder of something about, assimilating in a neighborhood, knowing how to sort of code switch or speak in an interview. That's a very good predictor of these sort of longer run outcomes, and a range of measures of sort of optimism and sort of connection rather than things operating through test scores. So as a summary, this is what MTO found. For parents, it's moving to tranquility. For kids, it's moving to opportunity. It depends on the years of exposure, just like the quasi-experimental moves data. So to conclude, with the beep, I'll just give you one little hint of what we're trying to do moving forward. It's just we're working on a new project calling Creating Moves to Opportunity, in which, given I think we have pretty good experimental and quasi-experimental evidence that if we could use existing resources for affordable housing to help more low-income families move to areas using those sorts of maps with higher upward mobility for their kids, we think we could have a really big impact. So we're working with 17 different public housing authorities in the U.S. in trying to reduce some of these historical and existing barriers to mobility, particularly through information. Those with Section 8 housing choice vouchers often don't have listings to move to other areas, trying to create greater salience to schools and neighborhoods, and also through trying to work with rental brokers and counselors to sort of mediate initial meetings with landlords to deal with a lot of the racial and housing voucher sort of discrimination. We're sort of up and running, starting a pilot in Seattle and King County. We had a meeting in August with the different public housing authorities in the Twin Cities area, and we're hoping, I know Greg Ross at the Minneapolis Public Housing Authority is quite excited about potentially trying to do a test here as well. So I'll just leave you with, we think that the ability of big data to map out which areas might have opportunity bargains for families, combined with tests of different mechanisms, has a lot of potential for trying to shed light on why neighborhoods matter and how to improve outcomes for low-income families in the face of rising segregation and differences in neighborhood outcomes that Kendra documented.
Thank you so much. So we have until 11:35, so we have about 20 minutes. And there's a lot of people in the room, so try to keep your questions and remarks brief. And we have a microphone, so Professor Lazier.
Hi, I'll start. Eddie Lazier from Stanford. Two questions, one for Larry and one for Steve et al., I guess. Larry, of course, we've talked about this a lot, and so I apologize to you for kind of raising the same point, but you put some new data up, and so I'll raise the point in a slightly different way and hopefully more constructive. So the issue that I've always worried about with Larry's work and the moving to opportunity is that think about having two houses, house 1 and house 2, and two people, A and B, and you move A from house 1 to house 2, well, then you also move B from house 2 to house 1, and what we want to know is the new equilibrium better than the old equilibrium? In other words, is the new sorting a better sorting than the old one? And so I guess what I would be interested in hearing you talk about is not just the move to opportunity, but also the move to failure. So now you've vacated a house in the neighborhood, someone else moves in there, and what you kind of want to do is think about netting those two out. And so at least at an empirical level, one would think that you could actually get at that. And so that's just a suggestion for at least thinking about it. And maybe you have some thoughts, maybe you already have, and have some reactions to it. And then Steve, you raised this, this is kind of a general comment, but I like the way you put this in the context of Beverly High School. The way I always think about it is, you see sumo wrestlers eat a lot. And they eat a lot, perhaps because all sumo wrestlers eat a lot and they see other sumo wrestlers eating a lot. Or it may be that you have to weigh a lot in order to win. And so I guess the question that I would ask at the empirical level is how much of these correlations that we see are essentially picking up the kind of factors that we would think of as individual, which you referred to, and how much of it is the social stuff. Because when we think of the social stuff as being important, this is essentially an R-squared exercise. It's essentially how much does the social stuff contribute beyond what you would get from just the personal stuff. So perhaps Kendra and Larry and Steve, you can shed some light on that.
Eddie always asks the hard question. Of course, we don't have direct experimental evidence on the general equilibrium effects of changing the sorting, but the way I like to think of it, one thing I think that does shed some light is the extent you think the mechanism is childhood exposure effects, the extent to which you are moving families with young kids to better areas and displacing other families that don't have young kids from those areas where the neighborhood effects are much less important for those families, I think is potentially a win-win situation if effectively we were using, say, things like housing vouchers to improve the purchasing power of families with children, to improve their neighborhoods, and if we're displacing families that don't have children, I think that is, or with ones, so that's one. The other is something we just don't know good answer is, we really tried to search for nonlinearities and heterogeneity. MTO is just not powerful enough to do it. If you get people out of just the worst areas and we could really do that, would it really make a very much difference, or is it in changing someone from a 10% to 20% doesn't have much effect, but if we get people out of 40% poverty areas, it really make a difference? That, the extent to which there's sort of tipping and nonlinearities, you really, if everyone could get out of the really worse areas and reduce segregation, it would really make a difference. The evidentiary basis for that is very weak right now. I mean, we just didn't have the ability. Jeff Kling, Jeff Liebman, and I spent a lot of time, but we couldn't reject linearity, but we couldn't reject extreme, differences of nonlinearities where if you really, you wouldn't have, what we do have a little evidence on from work by people like Ingrid Gould-Ellen and others, and is building project-based, developments in areas that are somewhat better off. Do they seem to have negative externalities on the others? And there's not much evidence for that. There's a little evidence that Rebecca Diamond is doing on low-income housing. If you build them in really rich areas, they definitely seem to have negative effect on housing prices. But I think that's, at some level, we're going to try to look with these place-based policies that do larger interventions at some of those spillover effects, but the evidence is much weaker than at the individual level.
Stephen?
I mean, in terms of the empirical evidence, I think I'd put it in three categories. So one question is whether one can identify total effects of interventions. That's an example is MTO. And the evidence, I think, if one looks across studies, not just of MTO, is that one can find salient neighborhood effects, and ones that matter in terms of well-being. The second question would be, with observational data, is there evidence of the various mechanisms I've talked about matter? And I could make the prosecutor's brief in favor of the different ones that I outlined. You, however, asked for the third type of evidence, which is not one I think that one can say much about. What I mean by that is, if I were to take something such as observed levels of intergenerational mobility, what sort of decompositions would I engage in to identify the roles of different factors? And I think that that's a relatively, the literature itself is modest. I could identify perhaps half a dozen papers that may be an exaggeration, that try to do the decompositions, but they're all predicated on extremely linear environments. And so from my vantage point, I think that's an open question. It's actually something that I'm beginning to work on, but talk is cheap. But the serious point is that I don't think I could make an honest statement that there's a natural decomposition either of intergenerational correlation coefficients or more sophisticated measures. The second question you asked is an identification question, which is that if one is thinking about identifying social influences, one needs to account for self-selection, and that's the issue of the sumo wrestlers as an example. I think that the one would give there's several things I would say there. First, clearly the experimental evidence is powerful, partially because it is somewhat successful in addressing that. The second thing I'd say, for what it's worth, is that my judgment of the econometrics literature is that we actually have quite a bit of machinery to constructively address self-selection. What I mean by that is I sort of gave you two types of problems. One problem is that if social structure is endogenous, you have this issue of homophily. Is it people birds of a feather, or is it actually a social influence? The second was something about aggregated unobserved heterogeneity. There's an unobserved teacher quality in the classroom, so on and so forth. What I would say at a methodological level is that for social scientists, it's a lot easier to deal with self-selection, or qualitatively easier to deal with self-selection and endogeneity, because that's what we do for a living. We model it. In other words, the answer to an environment where one is worried about self-selection, well, there's two strategies. One is to try to instrument, but the other one is simply to expand the model. And what one can show, for example, is there are environments in which identification fails under random assignment. It holds under self-selection on unobservables. That sounds paradoxical, but the serious point, which I put on the table, which I think is interesting, is that self-selection is another behavior. So if I want to measure social interaction effects, it's useful to me to see how people have decided to organize themselves. And so my view is that self-selection is actually an opportunity for coming up with better estimates. Now, there are a few, the devil's in the details, of course. There's a few papers that have done that. So what I would say is I believe I could make the prosecutor's brief that it properly accounts for self-selection. I would make the stronger argument that a constructive way to deal with it is simply to expand the way that we do the empirical work to allow for the self-selection to provide triangulation on social interaction effects.
Thank you.
Christina Arellano from the Minneapolis Fed. So I had a question for Larry. So this experimental evidence, of course, is very interesting and neat. But if you want to take it to the macro, and it's related to the previous question, if you want to take it to a macro policy, you would see the map and you say, let's move everybody to the Bay Area. Of course, you're not taking into account potential congestion effects. Or in the context of Minneapolis, let's move everybody out of St. Paul and put it in Minnetonka. And so, how do you think about for a macro policy these issues?
Well, so there are different levels of macro. So, for example, there are too few people in the Bay Area. Because of huge land use regulations, in fact. My senior thesis almost 40 years ago was about the growth of land use regulations in the San Francisco Bay Area as an undergraduate at UC Berkeley, and how this was potentially going to be a large threat to being affordable housing for many families. So there are some aspects. There are very high productivity parts of the United States, the San Francisco Bay Area, Boston metropolitan area, Manhattan, which increasingly, when positive shocks happen to their sectors, housing prices and wages of existing residents go up, and much too little migration happens there. So I do believe, I think there are very similar things happening in many European countries, that there are potentially substantial macro effects. There was work I did 25 years ago with Olivier Blanchard about how mobility across areas from declining to rising areas was a very big part of how the U.S. Had wage and income convergence across areas and dealt with shocks to unemployment. That has fallen secularly. One potential reason for that Peter Ganong and Danny Shoag have looked at is the growth of restrictive land use regulations in high productivity areas, the growth of NIMBY and the regulatory. So I think that there are potentially large general equilibrium effects of work that Enrico Moretti and Chang Shea argue that U.S. productivity would be way higher if the 6 highly restrictive, very productive parts of the U.S. were bigger. Even taking out congestion, and environmentally it would be better also if we were building up and less sort of sprawl. So I think that's another question is within metro areas, which is Eddie's question, the general equilibrium effect of allowing. And I sort of take it that it doesn't seem like having the level of income segregation of 1970 was a major disaster on U.S. Economic performance. We seem to have a more equal society. We seem to be growing pretty big. So I think that the growth of inequality has led to these reinforcing mechanisms that Steve has talked about and things that offset that. I don't think we're going to be. There's growing evidence from schools that, in fact, having some more diverse and poorer kids in schools for richer kids actually makes the richer kids better off. I think that's, there's work in places like India and the US. I think that, there are these individual decisions leading to bad social outcomes here that, in fact, if we had more diverse neighborhoods, it would, both give greater upward mobility to poor kids, and it's not clear there'd be any negative effects on the richer kids. In fact, they might have a stronger environment, but leaving decentralized decisions doesn't lead you to that equilibrium, because everyone wants, purchasing power goes with income, and anything that leads to rising income inequality tends to lead to rising segregation.
Can I?
Yeah, please.
You've brought up a very deep question, and this is one of the areas where structural modeling is probably necessary to talk about the general equilibrium effects. Can I suggest a different route? which is to ask, are there ways to think about why segregation would be excessive and inefficient? In other words, that's a more limited question. And there's a couple of answers one can give. The one I'll put on the table is the following, and that is that we think about the incentives for segregation, they're often static. What do I mean by that? I care about my child, that's it. All right. And if I push this a little bit, that actually could produce efficient outcomes if it were the case that kids only went to school for 1 year. And this sounds like a strange thing. That's the Becker marriage model. If people self-organize in a static world and there's complementarity, there's actually a result that says segregation maximizes the average of something. That's a very powerful idea, and it tells us that there are forces in economy/society that lead to segregation. And furthermore, they can be interpreted as efficient, right? Now consider a different question, which is, I only care about my child, and I'm thinking about them starting at age 5 in kindergarten, going through school. Would the social planner choose segregation of classrooms year by year in the same way he or she would do in the static problem? The answer is no. And the point I'm trying to put on the table, maybe I'm not being clear about this, and I apologize, is that if we think about the trajectories of children, what a social planner would want to do is to shape the distribution of the entire distribution of the characteristics of the kids year by year by year, even if in the last year it was perfectly efficient to segregate them. And so it turns out once one begins to think about the dynamics of the process of skill formation amongst children, one can infer from that that there would be inefficiently high levels of segregation because the selection has to do with averages, whereas in every period except the terminal one, you actually need to shape the whole density.
Thank you so much. Okay, we're entering the lightning round of the Q&A session, so please keep your questions and answers brief so we can hear from you more.
John Moon with the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco. So the Federal Reserve in San Francisco is involved in a place-based initiative that's being funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, the Ford Foundation, and the Kresge Foundation, looking at investments in the built environment to reduce economic disparities and health disparities. It's modeled after a similar initiative called the Building Healthy Communities Initiative by the California Endowment, $1 billion in 14 places across California. One of the underlying assumptions that we have is akin to agency. So if you have more individual agency, you can improve health at an individual level. It's also community agency. So at a community level, if you can empower communities to have greater voice in formal and informal decision making about what gets invested in built environments, so access to transportation, improved access to affordable housing. The idea here is that by building stronger community agency and political will, that can also help to reduce economic and health disparities. I'm curious what literature or thoughts that you might have on this question of the role of political agency, community agency in addressing economic opportunity.
Kendra should take that, sir. Bailiwick.
Oh, I don't know if I have anything to say specifically about political agency and economic opportunity, but it seems that certainly in places where people can invest and make decisions about their own communities, that's probably helpful for understanding the kinds of jobs and job opportunities that people need. I don't have any specific literature that speaks to that, and I know Larry's doing some work on place-based initiatives. I mean, I think, the issue with the moving to opportunity, the obvious issue is that there's going to be some lost gains from the move itself, and so I think that this movement towards improving people in place is a movement in the right direction, in part because it's probably more scalable than moving people, but also because it gives people agency and hopefully helps break that cycle over long term, right? I mean, if we're moving people, there's this issue that we're not sure if we're changing the neighborhoods, leaving some other people there, right, who are going to be growing up in these neighborhoods. And so initiatives to sort of change the place itself, I think, probably has more promise for breaking that cycle of having that intergenerational effect of neighborhoods over time. But maybe Larry has something to add about that.
Yeah, I mean, MTO is at the individual level certainly shows the very strong effects of neighborhood environments on health. And so that feeds into For the U.S., I don't know of really great causal work on this. There is growing work in development economics on doing interventions of sort of community voice and participation in decisions, work people like Ben Olken have been doing in Indonesia, work being done in some high violence areas, people like Chris Blattman and Drilla Dubé. And my reading of that evidence, so you can randomize across areas in whether decisions are made top down or whether there's more input from community members. And there's some evidence that giving people group decisions to make, and then we sort of test this by giving them other decisions to make, improves their ability to come to good social decisions. The other area where this is very interesting is in the workplace. So there have been some experiments on changing pay inequality. Supreet Kaur at UC Berkeley and Emily Breza have done this, where they randomize essentially differentials in pay, and then they have people do group activities. These are in real factories in India over like several months. And they find that where there were greater pay disparities, they're much less able, both the workers don't like each other, and they're much less able to sort of do group decisions. So, but it was the sort of arbitrariness of disparities that sort of some people being privileged others when there were clear productivity relations. So I think there's a growing body of evidence trying to experiment with decision making and perception of disparities. I think in the US setting, we have lots of correlations that communities do this, but I think there's been less clever experimental causal evidence that I know of. Although I know Tony Ito runs the California Endowment, has been, there's a lot of interesting work from their 14 sites. And there have been some interesting changes in California on things like suspensions in schools versus things that look more like restorative justice as a way to try to deal with policies that are potentially promising here.
Thank you so much. We'll take one more lightning. You guys are not good at lightning, but
Sorry.
because we're out of time. But
So hi, I'm Veronica Guerrieri from Booth. So I want to go back briefly to the macro question and using something that Steve was talking about. So I was wondering, there is this feedback between like segregation and inequality, and there are policies like moving to opportunity that help like reducing segregation in the hope also of reducing inequality overall. Clearly, there is another way we can go, and probably I was thinking we could do that, couple this policy together other policy that try to attack the inequality that reduces incentive to segregation, and so maybe coupling like this type of policy together with, as you were saying, investing in the low opportunity area can resolve the problem that people were worried about moving people back in the poor area. And one more thing is that in Chicago, Cabrini Green has been demolished. So I wonder if other areas probably have not been demolished after these vouchers have been given to the kids. I was wondering if there has been research to see.
Well, that's what we're starting to do research on, linking these episodes and finding control areas to compare. So that's what we hopefully in the next year or two will have some answers.
okay, well, join me in thanking the panelists.